everybody. I'm Lisa Eichler-Clark. I'm Director of Sustainable Climate Action here at the University of Michigan at the School for Environment and Sustainability. We're so excited that you're here with us today. We have a fantastic conversation for the next few minutes, but before we get started, I do want to just take a moment and make sure that we have talked through our land acknowledgements. We acknowledge the land that we stand on was obtained through an 1817 land transfer from the Anishinaabeg, the Three Fires people, as well as the Fox, Peoria, and Wyandotte. I invite you to go ahead and take a look at the full acknowledgement here, but I just want to point out a couple of things that are important. We acknowledge that our university stands on land, like almost all property in the United States, that was generally obtained in unconscionable ways from indigenous people. In addition, our research, science, and sustainability has benefited and continues to benefit through this access to land gained through the exploitation of others. So thank you for your attention. We think that this is a really critical component of the work that we do, certainly at SEAS as well as the university, as we raise equity issues through the lens that we're looking at for sustainability. So recognizing this certainly does not undo history, but it's an important step towards the creation of an equitable and sustainable future. One example of one of the projects that we're working on together is a new SEAS Global Center for Understanding Climate Impacts on Transboundary Waters, which is a lot of words, but it's an exciting effort that brings into account climate change with an emphasis on indigenous communities on both sides of the national borders, so it's a binational effort. In addition, the University of Michigan, in collaboration with the College of Menominee Nation, is set to play a pivotal role in a newly announced National Science Foundation Center for Embracing Indigenous Knowledges in Science. This effort, which is being propelled by the Mathai Botanical Garden in collaboration with SEAS and other partners at the university, as well as other universities, I should mention, will unite indigenous knowledge systems with Western science to address some of the most pressing issues of our time. So this is important and impactful work that we really think is going to help us continue to be the leaders and the best as we move forward. Before we get started with an introduction to our distinguished speaker, I'd like to thank the other parts of the university that all came together to put this together for you. So obviously, School for Environment and Sustainability. We're thrilled to be housed here in the Ross School of Business and certainly appreciate working with our friends at the Graham Sustainability Institute and our friends at the Urban Institute as well, and many others that have helped promote the event here today. So thank you to all of you that are in the room, although I will point out that my son is not, and also to those of you that have joined us online. And now I'd like to introduce our special guest, Shalanda Baker. The Honorable Shalanda Baker is the Director of the Office of Economic Impact and Diversity at the U.S. Department of Energy. We were talking a little bit about our shared boss, who she works very closely with now. Prior to her Senate confirmation, she served as the nation's first ever Deputy Director for Energy Justice. And I just want to spend a moment on that sentence because Senate confirmation is no joke. And so I think that anyone who receives Senate confirmation just bumps up a little bit in my esteem for having done that. Before joining the Biden-Harris administration, she was a professor of law, public policy, and urban affairs at Northeastern University in Boston, Massachusetts, and also made a quick stop, I shouldn't say quick, she also made a stop in in the Midwest with our friends, the Badgers, down the road at the University of Michigan. She spent over a decade conducting research on the equity dimensions of the global transition away from fossil fuel energy to cleaner energy resources. She's the co-founder and former co-director of the Initiative for Energy Justice, an organization committed to providing technical, law, and policy support to communities on the front lines of climate change. And in her book, Revolutionary Power, An Activist's Guide to the Energy Transition, she argues that the technical terrain of energy policy should be the next domain to advance civil rights. I don't think that this conversation could be more timely, given the narrow window that is happening in Lansing for energy legislation here in Michigan right now. And in fact, there was one bill that was passed out of the Senate yesterday and a few more in the package that may even be moving as soon as today, who knows. But bringing together the issues of energy and justice could not possibly be more timely for our discussion here in Michigan and, of course, broadly across the nation. So it's my pleasure to welcome our distinguished guest, Shalanda Baker, to give a few comments, and then we will get quickly to your questions.
Thank you so much. Thank you so much, Dr. Clark. It is really Such a pleasure to be here today, and thank you all for being here. Oh my gosh, what an audience, what a crowd. Some of you may know my dear friend and colleague and co-conspirator, Dr. Tony Reams, over here in the corner. You all know him as Professor Reams, but he's on loan to us from you all for a few years, and we've been so delighted to be in the trenches together. And I'm really proud to be here talking to your community, Tony, so thank you for facilitating all of these relationships. I also want to thank the School for Environment and Sustainability for inviting me here and for making space to really elevate environmental justice. So I don't know what you thought you were coming into here today, but we're going to get into it. We're going to get into it. I'm excited to have a conversation with you, Dr. Clark. I'm also excited to engage this community because I think you're listening and you're thinking about issues of justice and grappling with them in all of your work on environment and all of your work in the climate space. I'm going to offer 3 questions to kind of guide my talk, but also guide our discussion writ large. The first question is justice possible in this transition? Is justice possible in this transition? The second question is, are freedom and liberation possible through the transition of our energy system? Are freedom and liberation possible through the transition of our energy system? And the third question is, how do we avoid the mistakes of the past when it comes to communities disproportionately bearing the cost of the energy system while receiving so few of its benefits? Let me say that one again. How do we avoid the mistakes of the past when it comes to communities disproportionately bearing the costs of the energy system while receiving so few of its benefits? Scholars of energy justice know where that question comes from. But before we get into grappling with these 3 questions, I need you to know my priors. I need you to know who I am. So people often ask me how I first became involved with energy justice. The truth is, it's always really been a part of my story before I even knew the term energy justice. I'm the daughter and the granddaughter and the great-granddaughter of sacrifice zones. The daughter and granddaughter and great-granddaughter of environmental injustice. My father grew up in a place that is so toxic that families are still asked to shelter in place due to the illegal emissions of hazardous materials into the air. I'm the daughter and great-granddaughter of that place, which is Port Arthur, Texas, part of the Golden Triangle, which is the birthplace and the epicenter of the modern fossil fuel industry. So generations of families like mine are dotted with gaping holes in their family trees, where family members died way too young due to heart disease, due to cancer, and other mysterious ailments. So my story is wrapped up in this nation's battle against energy insecurity as well. I can remember cold nights in Austin when we'd boil water on the stovetop to get hot water for our baths. So this is in a state, Texas, with low energy costs relative to the rest of the country. I lived in a home that was headed by a government worker, someone who should have been able to live freely, to thrive in this country. But I have an environmental injustice aspect of my history, and I also have an energy insecurity aspect of my history, growing up in a home where it was difficult, where every month my mom had to make choices about whether to heat or eat. And so in that home in Austin, we should have been thriving, but we were not. We were like over half of Black Americans today. We were energy insecure. So, and if that stat didn't make you jump a little bit, over half of Black Americans in this country live with energy insecurity, making the choice of whether to heat or cool your home or eat. That's today in America. So I spent the first part of my career as a professional serving in the US military and the Air Force. And when I left the Air Force, I became a project finance lawyer First on the East Coast, working to build energy projects with developers, and then in Japan, which was a wild and crazy experience. But I left legal practice in 2009, and I found myself in Oaxaca. Oaxaca is a really special place to me. It's one of the most fascinating places in Mexico. It's home to over 14 different indigenous groups who speak distinct indigenous languages. They're also home to ground zero for Mexico's energy transition. So I met indigenous leaders there in Oaxaca who were fighting against wind energy. They were fighting for justice and a seat at the table with wind energy developers who were transforming their landscape with impunity, without free prior informed consent, and actually dispossessing them of generations of wealth. But they were doing so in the name of fighting climate change. From Mexico, I was able to get a tenure track job in Hawaii. I'll go to all the great places. So I was in Hawaii, and fortunately I had a front row seat to that state's energy transition during a time when no state in the union dared to envision an energy future that was 100% clean and renewable. So during the early days of my career, from around 2009 and 10 to around 2014, no one was really talking about energy justice, except for that guy, maybe, Tony Reams and I. But no one in this country. Lots of folks in Europe were talking about energy justice in different ways. But those two words never really met in a sentence in our discourse around climate and our discourse around the energy transition. It was always only about climate. It was always only about environment. But justice issues, they were really relegated to discussions about sovereignty and civil rights, but justice didn't really have a home in the energy debates, didn't have a home in the climate debates. So once I started digging into the issues at the nexus of energy, justice, and climate, I realized that the place that I needed to be didn't yet exist. And I hope the students are listening. I realized the place that I needed to be didn't yet exist. My work, my intellectual community, did not yet exist. So I created it. I started a nonprofit in Hawaii focused on connecting communities in Hawaii to the energy policy debate. The world I saw showed me just how intimately the energy system connected with every aspect of life in terms of pollution borne, in terms of the cost of energy. But yet those same people were so disconnected to the energy policy debates that were going to shape their future for generations. A few years later, at Northeastern University, I was fortunate to start another organization, as Dr. Clark said, the Initiative for Energy Justice, to bring community voices into the energy policy debate and into the energy policy making space nationally, building on lessons I learned in Hawaii, building on lessons learned in New York and California. And shortly after the election in 2020, the president-elect tapped me to be his administration's energy justice lead, to lead this country's energy transition and to make sure that it was just and equitable, to ensure that no one, no community breathing toxic fumes, no mother struggling to pay her bills, no one still living without lights in 2023, and I've met those people, would be left behind in our energy transition. So that leads me to our first question. All of that was just to the first question. Is justice possible in this transition? Well, maybe. President Biden and Secretary Jennifer Granholm, who is your former governor, asked me to lead the Office of Economic Impact and Diversity. And this is an office that I hadn't heard of before being asked to lead it. It's an office that many people who apply for DOE funding regularly have never heard of, but it was formed in 1978, in the early days of the department, to advise the Secretary of Energy on policy issues affecting communities of color specifically in this country. The office was also formed to do research on the social and environmental impacts of the energy system on people of color in this country. Yeah, really. In 1978, there was an office solely designed to look after communities of color, to look at the impacts of the energy system and our DOE programs on communities of color. The office also has an economic development mandate to link Black and brown businesses and universities that serve communities of color to the billions of dollars we have available at the agency. Again, 1978, how prescient. It's amazing to me to think about those days, to think that lawmakers in a bipartisan way, well, those are that's a sentence that doesn't happen very often anymore. But in 1978, Congress said, let's create an office that looks after communities of color, because we know the energy system is not equitable. And we need to make sure that the energy system and the energy economy provides pathways for justice and equity. So that's what I do in my office. And that's why I say justice is possible. But we have a long road ahead of us. The data is pretty clear. I shared some statistics with you. But we also know that communities of color, Black communities in particular, are not only more likely to be experiencing energy insecurity, but they're also more likely to live in the shadows of fossil fuel generation. These are the same communities that bear, again, the burdens of our energy system without receiving so many of its benefits. In the literature on environmental justice, we call them sacrifice zones. So these communities are sacrificed. Our own data at the Department of Energy, as I mentioned, also tells us that these communities pay a disproportionate amount of overall household income to meet energy needs. We know that that problem is endemic. As I mentioned, over half of Black households in this country experience energy insecurity. It's an invisible problem. It's a hidden problem. It's not something that we talk about every day. 47% of Latinx households in this country experience the same thing. That is unconscionable in 2023. So this tiny little office, the Office of Economic Impact and Diversity, which in the past 32 months has grown from around 35 people to over 100, has become the center of the fight for justice within this energy transition. In the past 32 months, with this incredible team that I've been able to lead and build, we have rewired the agency, the Department of Energy, to make justice a real possibility in an agency that has primarily concerned itself with research and development rather than people, places, and communities. So justice is possible, but we need to stay focused. We need to stay focused on the ways in which inequality is insidious and our rules and processes unwittingly replicate injustice. That's the vigilance that we enter our work with every single day. So as to my second question, are freedom and liberation possible through the transition of our energy system? Are freedom and liberation possible through the transition of our energy system? I want to let you know that we have some mighty tools, unprecedented tools at our disposal right now. 7 days into this administration, President Biden issued Executive Order 14008. I know many of you in the climate world were applauding that executive order. Tucked into that executive order in Section 223 was the Justice 40 initiative. And in Section 223, the president says, we are making the commitment as a federal family, we're setting the goal as a federal family, that 40% of the overall benefits of federal spending on climate and clean energy will go to underserved and overburdened communities, will go to frontline folks, those who have been fighting for environmental justice for so long. So that's one tool in our toolkit. About a year later, the president was able to sign into law the Bipartisan Infrastructure Law, and a little bit after that, the Inflation Reduction Act. So these laws, affectionately known as Bill and Ira, have provided a historic opportunity to support clean energy installations, access to solar for low-income communities, access to small-scale wind and community solar in low-income communities, creating supply chains for some of the critical minerals that we need, as well as things like battery manufacturing, recycling, and again, large-scale industrial development. All of that is housed within the Bipartisan Infrastructure Law and facilitated through some of the tax credits in the Inflation Reduction Act. At the Department of Energy, we have $100 billion, billion with the B, again, unprecedented. And these are taxpayer funds, let me just be clear, to catalyze a clean energy transition. So we are committed at the department to ensuring that these projects create real economic and environmental benefits for the communities and workers where they are located. Again, at the Department of Energy, we've been focused on research and development. We've never been focused on people. We've never been focused on communities. So this is a big lift for us. But we're committed to making sure that Bill and Ira, as much as the laws will permit, provide pathways for freedom, provide pathways for liberation. And a little over a year ago, we created a novel framework to ensure that that is true. We created the Community Benefits Plan framework. So we now require that every single applicant for Department of Energy Bill or IRA funds has to create a community benefits plan. The CBPs, as we call them, because we love acronyms in the federal family, allow the department to ensure that the socioeconomic and environmental effects of our energy programs, policies, and regulations do not actually have that disproportionate negative impact on communities. Don't have the disproportionate impact on those communities that are already overburdened by pollution. And so in our CBPs, they allow us to push for stakeholder engagement in unprecedented ways. They allow us to push for job creation in places that have always been left behind. We've made a lot of promises to some communities for a long time. But CBPs allows us to push for economic development in those communities that have always been left behind. So through Justice 40 and through CBPs, my office, the Department of Energy, and the Biden-Harris administration are moving our nation ever closer to the promise of justice, ever closer to the promise of freedom and liberation for all people. So we have some goals as we're marching toward freedom and marching toward liberation. It's our goal to eliminate the energy burden in households that are disproportionately impacted by high energy costs and the lack of reliable access to uninterrupted energy sources at an affordable price. It's our goal to do that. It's our goal to ensure that the energy transition does not place additional social and environmental burdens on communities of color. It's also our goal, for the first time ever, to place Black, Indigenous, people of color, and low-income communities at the core of our energy transition, at the core of energy policy. And it's our goal to ensure that all communities share in the incredible wealth that is going to be created by this energy transition. We also recognize that we operate within myriad systems that were not designed for equity. They were not designed for justice. They were not designed for freedom. They were not designed for liberation. And so every day, my team and so many colleagues across the Department of Energy fight. But we know that we can't do it alone. One office, one administration, one person. We can't do it alone. So as I enter the last part of my talk, I want to turn it over to you. It's actually on all of you to help us win, to help us create these pathways for freedom and liberation and justice. The last question, as I open up my remarks today, is how do we avoid the mistakes of the past when it comes to communities disproportionately bearing the cost of the energy system while receiving so few of its benefits? So we did a little research about you all, Michigan. So Michigan, like all states, is an essential part of bringing forth an equitable clean energy future. As of 2021, there were over 390,000 Michigan workers employed in the energy sector. I think you know those stats. In the Detroit metro area, over 70% of the electric power generation workforce was in wind, solar, and hydroelectric, and over 40,000 workers were employed in energy efficiency. Michigan is also home to almost 1 million small businesses, 900,000 small businesses, which represent 99.6% of all businesses. So our small businesses are the lifeblood of your economy here in Michigan. And they employ over 47.9% of all workers in the state. You set some ambitious goals in the state as well around carbon neutrality. You have the goal of carbon neutrality by 2050. And currently you have 3.7 gigawatts of solar, wind, and storage capacity. There's an additional 800 megawatts of additional planned wind and solar capacity already in the works, which will power almost 80,000 Michigan homes. So you've been on the path here in the state. But like so many other states, There's still room to ensure that the most disadvantaged here in the state can fully benefit from and participate in this energy transition. So how do we avoid the mistakes of the past, especially when it comes to those communities who have already borne the burdens but have received so few of its benefits? Your most vulnerable residents in this state face grave inequalities like toxic air, lead poisoning, and water shutoffs. A 2017 report from the NAACP showed that in Detroit, 2,402 Black children per year have asthma attacks due to gas pollution, natural gas pollution, and they missed over 1,700 days of school as a result. And so when you account for the fact that 40% of the population in Michigan counties have a refinery, and that those counties are, counties are a majority Black, that statistic starts to make a little bit more sense. We also know that here in your state, access to clean air is not the only issue. Access to clean water is also an issue. The cost of water has nearly doubled in some households since 2007. But I don't like to leave you only with gloom and doom, because we know that you have vibrant communities here that are fighting back, that are fighting for a seat at the table, that are fighting to be seen. In Highland Park, Michigan, an established coalition of community-based organizations and the city are working with our department, with the Communities Local Energy Action Program, also known as Communities LEAP, there goes another acronym, to accomplish their community's vision for a clean, efficient, and resilient energy future. In Detroit, the North End Woodward Community Coalition was selected as in the first round of the Community Power Accelerator Prize, which is a prize from the Department of Energy that seeks to expand access to community solar. That community is also fighting for a larger prize from the Department of Energy that will help them continue progress to meet their goals. Right here in Ann Arbor, you all are participating in a DOE-sponsored peer learning cohort that will help cities deploy new financing strategies for a more equitable clean energy future. So you're doing the work. You're doing the work, and change is happening here in your state. But we know that many gaps remain. We know that we all must stay vigilant. So what is our work together? What is your work as well as a community? Well, we have to continue to reckon every single day with structural racism and structural inequality and the ways in which those things are baked into the energy system. If we don't reckon with injustice in our march to tackle climate change, we will embed injustice into our energy transition. So scholars must confront these issues, whether you be engineers, climate scientists, data scientists, or economists, or lawyers. And I have met so many young people, both in my time as a professor, but also in my current role. And I know that for you all, the future is actually bright. I know you already get it. You already know that climate change is not simply a technology problem. You already know that the transition that we're in is a social technical transition. You also know that the problem of climate change is not a technical one, but it's a power problem. It's a resource problem. It's a justice problem. So back to our three questions. Is justice possible in this transition? Justice is a possibility only if we stay vigilant. And so that means that all of you and all of us at the Department of Energy can't let up, even when we're tired. And even when we have already done so much work. The work is not done. And I would also say that the work won't be done during my tenure. So the work must continue through all of you. The second question, are freedom and liberation possible through the transition of our energy system? I would say yes. In the past, I've argued that the energy system and energy policy is the next terrain to advance civil rights. We have historic tools at our disposal to advance a just and equitable energy transition. But again, the project can't be just about technology. It must always be about people. It must always be about the freedom and liberation of those on whose backs the current energy system was built. And so to the third question, how do we avoid the mistakes of the past? Well, we can only avoid the mistakes of the past if we grapple directly with the structural problems that created energy insecurity, that created environmental injustice. We have to dig in with rigor, with truth, to ensure that justice is our foundation and not just a conceptual framework. So again, if we don't do that hard work, the new system will be built on top of all of that inequality, all of that injustice. So, again, I don't know what you thought you were getting into when you decided to come here today at 10 a.m. to hear me talk. But I want to leave you with this. This is an extraordinary moment. I feel so blessed to be a part of it. But we're all a part of this moment. We were all born into this time with extraordinary challenges and extraordinary opportunities. This job is the hardest thing I've ever done in my life. But I wouldn't be anywhere else. And I'm so glad to share this space with you, to be in conversation about how you too can be a part of an equitable, clean energy future. So thank you so much for coming out. I'm looking forward to a great conversation with you. Thank you.
All right.
All right.
Thank you so much for your comments. You brought up a lot of really important themes, and I think we're going to have a chance to explore them with some good questions from the audience. I will take moderator's prerogative and ask you a first one.
Okay.
So you talked in your book a bit about climate fundamentalism, and we certainly heard that thread through your comments here today. And when we think about that three-legged stool of energy, climate, justice, and I'm going to add a fourth leg, resiliency, because I think that's such a critical issue for Michigan right now. I wonder how that has evolved for you from your experience prior to coming to your role with the federal government, and then what you've learned in the course of the last few years with the federal government. I bet it's been deeply informed. And so I was just curious, what have you taken away, and how has that shifted, cemented, or just been reinforced?
Yeah, so thank you so much for that question. I think about climate fundamentalism, carbon fundamentalism pretty regularly. And for those of you who haven't heard the term before, it's really this idea that because of the urgency of the climate crisis, we have to just focus on averting catastrophic climate change. And we can focus on justice later and append it to the end. I have become even more extreme in my view that there is no space for carbon fundamentalism or climate fundamentalism in this transition. Yeah, who's that in the back? And I've become more extreme in that view because, I'm in communities fairly routinely and see folks who think it's going to be different this time, who hope it's going to be different this time, who absolutely are in distress as a result of the current energy system. I take them with me into my work in DC and sort of try to channel them in policy conversations about how we're going to design this program or that program. Because I know that for them, time is running out, in terms of health, in terms of real economic opportunities. I mean, these are some of the same communities that had never recovered from the 2008 financial crisis. These are communities that have always been left behind. I mean, we were down in the Rio Grande Valley in April as a part of our Energy Justice to the People roadshow. And this is a roadshow where we're kind of going to different communities around the country. We spent a lot of time in the Gulf South most recently, but we were in the Rio Grande Valley, and we were meeting monolingual Spanish speakers who had no access to power in their homes, who barely had access to running water, who were living in colonias, which are unincorporated parts of that community. And so if in DC, I lined up with this idea, we sort of let me know if you can. I think I'm still pretty loud.
Can we take
that doesn't help other folks.
Can we take one of the handhelds? Thanks.
Thank you. Hello?
There we go.
Okay. So, I mean, if we just focused on, the technology, if we just focused on getting programs out in a way that met congressional deadlines on getting that money out, without thinking about how the program design actually impacted the mothers, the aunties, the uncles in the communities that we've seen, we would miss a tremendous opportunity to actually transform lives in places that are so distressed. So I'm more radicalized in my view that there's no place for carbon fundamentalism in this transition. I also think urgency is our enemy, and that's often the answer I get when people. Well, that's the response I get when people ask, okay, so how do we balance these two things? We have a rush. We have to run now to avert catastrophic climate change, and my answer is, look. The urgency piece is not going to save us. We actually, we need to be careful now because we're going to have to unwind so much down the road, and we're going to have to still make sure those communities are resilient down the road. I mean, these are the same people that without a foundation and without being placed at the center are going to need the most help if we're not putting them at the center now. So I'm still bullish in terms of bringing community voices in.
That's wonderful, and I can imagine you're seeing just incredible things in your seat now. Yeah, thank you. Am I working? Oh, am I out too? Okay, well, enough for me to talk anyway. So we've got a few questions I know queued up right here in the front, and I'm looking to Carol, who's going to have the mic. Thank you, Carol. Okay, question over here.
Hi, thank you so much for joining us today. My name is Anna Boyd, and I'm a second-year dual master student studying public policy and also studying environmental justice at the School for Environment and Sustainability. And my question here today relates to, I feel like, a transition that has been a topic of conversation in Ann Arbor, public power. And I'm curious, as cities consider forming municipal utilities, as is happening here in Ann Arbor, what type of equity considerations might arise as a result of cities breaking away from the investor-owned utility? Specifically, when an affluent city, like here in Ann Arbor, can afford feasibility studies and has resources to finance the purchase of infrastructure, what impacts might you anticipate for less resourced areas within a utility service territory? And how can we as policymakers and advocates address them? Thank you.
Wow. I mean, this is a hard question. It's not one that I had, that I grappled with when I was at the Initiative for Energy Justice, but it's something that, utility justice and thinking about the utility of the future was, those were both things that were always on my mind. Obviously, utilities play an outsized role in providing power, investor-owned utilities play an outsized role in providing power to ratepayers all over the country. I think when we think about municipalization and assets being pulled out of a service territory, I mean, the economics are always different, right, depending on what the area is. So I don't know the specific situation in Ann Arbor, but I think the underlying kind of sentiment to your question is, hey, if they're pulling assets out, they're also leaving maybe moderate and lower income ratepayers to pay for the existing assets, which are rate-based, right? So the cost of maintaining the grid is borne by ratepayers, and so that could leave those low-income, moderate-income folks paying more for energy. I mean, that's an equity issue. That's an equity challenge. I think, obviously, the utility sector is an interesting space. It's highly regulated. So I've always argued it's highly regulated, and it sort of operates in this gray zone of being in the private sphere, right? So there's sort of aspects that are not as well regulated. But in the regulatory sphere, I've always argued for more advocacy and more focus within the regulatory space. So I think there's an opportunity for communities to organize themselves, to understand more about what's happening in dockets. I mean, when I moved to Hawaii, everything was happening in a regulatory docket. Like, people were like, you have to get to the PUC. And I was like, the what? Like, I wasn't even sort of focused on the Public Utilities Commission, but that's where the rules of the road are actually created. And communities often are not even involved in that conversation because they think it's too complex. They think it's sort of Byzantine. And some of that is true. But a lot of it is fairly straightforward. So I think getting involved in the regulatory space is one way to ensure that the details of deal making, if assets are pulled out, are actually just and equitable, or at least justice is a crosscut. I think as a general rule, utility regulators should be incorporating justice and equity into all decision making, especially as we know the utility sector is going through a lot of transition along with the rest of the energy system. So my answer is regulation and the regulatory sphere. I think educating community members about what's happening in the regulatory space, it's not sexy, it's not, that accessible. So as a policymaker, making sure that information is widely available to community members, as academics, translating some of the complexity of what's happening in regulatory dockets for community members. I mean, that was something that we were doing at the Initiative for Energy Justice as well. So those are my 2 takeaways for you, but great question.
Hi. I'm so glad to have you here. I'm Sarah Mills. I am the director of our Center for Empowering Communities at the Graham Sustainability Institute, and I'm a faculty member in urban planning. Many states, including Michigan, are considering or have already moved decision-making authority for the largest power plants to the state level. And often the rationale for this is that it's slow at the local level, or communities are blocking projects and making it hard to attain clean energy goals. That this policy applies to the largest projects really means that it applies specifically to rural communities who have the space to host these projects. And in the context where these rural communities may not be environmental justice communities or may be largely white, I'm wondering if you could help us unpack how energy justice applies here.
Yeah. Well, I always hesitate to talk about energy justice in places because it does look different in every single community. For example, we know that communities are not a monolith when it comes to bringing large-scale generation into their communities. Some see it as a boon. Some see it as a way and a pathway for job creation. I think energy justice has to be about always, no matter what community is, at play, no matter what's happening in that community. Energy justice has to always be about setting the right table. So the fact that, decision-making authority has sort of been moved up one level away from the local is an interesting development. I mean, local communities should absolutely have a say at that state level and be a part of that conversation. I think state decision makers have to bring in folks from the local community, local decision makers. I mean, that is some of the work that we're trying to do also at the Department of Energy, which is to set the right table. So even if the main decision-making authority is happening at another level, those decision makers have to engage at all levels. I also think creating space for discourse and debate, and being willing to keep coming back. So there's something called restorative justice, which is a part of the energy justice framework. Restorative justice is really about healing. And sometimes healing takes a long time because the wounds are really deep and raw. And so again, every community is different, but restorative justice and recognition justice require that you take a community as it is and that you keep going back. You keep going back until progress is made. So setting the right table, recognizing that not every community is similarly situated, and really taking the approach that policymaking should be done from a restorative justice lens to actually help heal and facilitate the healing of a community. So that's what I would offer as a frame, not knowing a lot of the details of what's happening here, but as a frame, as a beginning, to start having those conversations.
We're going to make Carol run. This is dangerous because Carol has a habit of stumbling.
Good morning. Thank you for being here. you see me?
Yes, I can see you.
Okay. My name is Tristan Keen, and I'm a second-year doctoral student in the Ross Business School. And my dissertation is mostly focused on how activists target firms who are dependent on the critical minerals that is needed for the green energy transition. So my first question is in regards to the Inflation Reduction Act. We know that a lot of the resource-rich countries who possess a lot of these critical minerals that's needed for the green economy is located in areas such as the DRC, cobalt in the DRC, lithium in the South Americas, and nickel in Indonesia. And a lot of these countries don't have a free trade agreement with the United States, so they're not under the provisions of the Inflation Reduction Act. And since we do have a lot of U.S. firms who are sourcing from these regions, and as you mentioned, not repeating the mistakes of the past, whether that is in regards to the colonial nature of mining that happened generations ago, what is the Biden administration thinking about how do we include these countries in the equitable transition in the green economy, considering that they don't have a free trade agreement status, but they do possess a lot of the resources that is needed for this transition, and those communities are getting harmed and left behind.
Yeah, it's such a complex issue, and I love that you're studying it. I mean, I think initially sort of thinking about justice just in large-scale renewable energy development was a challenge, and people weren't talking about that. And someone, Ria Theofrancos, who's a scholar at Rhode Island, was talking about at Providence College. She was talking about, okay, we have to also think about critical minerals because that's the next domain, really, in the clean energy transition. So your project is super specific, and I love it. And I hope that the research you're doing really gets disseminated. So in the Biden-Harris administration, I mean, obviously, as you mentioned, in the Inflation Reduction Act, we have sort of guardrails on foreign content, and we're really trying to promote the domestic production of our renewable energy resources, and that's throughout the entire supply chain. So that does create some guardrails. It allows us to set our own standards regarding content, regarding treatment of workers, et cetera. But I do think, so I haven't been specifically involved in the conversations around critical minerals, but obviously as a nation, we're supportive of advancing human rights. As a scholar who did a lot of work in the international development realm, I think this is a gap where we need international frameworks on standards. We need international frameworks that are enforceable. In the international law realm, enforceability is always gray and always a challenge. And I've always argued that the private sector is where standards can be set and where peers can sort of come together to think about what the floors are. I don't want to dip my toes in the water regarding the types of tools that we have at our disposal in terms of restrictions and standards, but there are some opportunities, I think, to begin to think through what those guardrails would be should we run into a situation where we actually need a lot of those critical minerals to come into the United States. So I think you're ahead of the game in terms of starting to contemplate frameworks that would allow us to continue to adhere to social and environmental kind of standards. And again, that's why your work is so important to get out. And I'm hopeful that your work and others who are working in this field like Thea can actually help us think through these frameworks. But it's a gray area. I think there's a lot of work to be done. So thank you for the question.
We have time for one more audience question. I'm going to run up here and give people up here a chance.
Thank you so much for your presentation and then just also leading the national movement. My name is Adora. I serve at the City of Detroit as a Fund Development Officer. My portfolio is mostly the critical infrastructure sector departments, and so this is really right on par. I echo everything that you were saying because I personally believe that the climate equity and environmental justice or sustainability movement can be an anti-racism movement if it's centered on Black and Indigenous people, because Black and Indigenous people aren't facilitating what we're seeing globally in terms of environmental and economic terrorism or neo-plantation economy, however we want to spin it. And so I have two questions. The first question is around formula funding. Do you anticipate that the federal government will increase because data is available, especially for cities like Detroit, where environmental health disparities are well documented? Do you anticipate that formula funding will increase in these areas? And then the second part is around what you mentioned with communities and people being at the center. Will there also be strategies to ensure that applications are low barrier so that high impact organizations are able to access federal funding?
Great. Thank you so much for the question. I'm going to turn it over to Dr. Tony Reams to to answer the first question. So Tony's the number 2 in the State and Community Energy Programs Office, where a lot of our formula funding at the Department of Energy lives. I mean, most of it actually lives there. I'm not sure about the answer to the first question, but I'm going to take it back and think about it. My understanding is, we are relying on data that is out there, and we have heard from advocates that the formulas aren't actually providing them with the adequate amount of resources to deliver on community needs. So I'm going to take it back. There are always constraints that we operate within, and we, again, are pushing as much as we can within those constraints. But thank you for that question. On the second question, I can offer a lot more. So, again, my boss, Jennifer Granholm, she is very much about people. She's very much about communities. And, she's always, since day one, been talking about place-based development, place-based impacts. She named me as the lead to lead work in Port Arthur, actually. We were there in June as a part of our road show. And she's like, let's think about specific ways we can help impact and change this community through our resources. Again, we have limited tools in our toolkit, but through our resources, through partnerships with interagency partners in the federal family as well. We're working in the Gulf South. We're here as well, and there are places and communities that have been elevated through our Communities LEAP program as well. So the Communities LEAP program is sort of it's a flagship program in our effort to really lower the barriers that you talked about for underrepresented and underserved communities to actually access DOE resources. So historically, those who have been able to access DOE resources have been the most sophisticated research universities like Michigan, Berkeley, Stanford, who routinely apply for DOE funds. But we knew that in this moment, we actually needed to make sure communities were able to access some of the technology and technological advancements that we have going on at the department. So Communities LEAP was designed to lower barriers to entry. The law allows us to do that. So we now have a lot of flexibility, and we're experimenting with that flexibility to create prizes. So prizes are very simple, applications, prizes are designed to allow for very simple applications from community-based organizations. And they tend to be smaller amounts of funding, but they can also lead to bigger funding and allow the community to connect with other grantees within our DOE family of grantees. So we're experimenting. I've also heard of colleagues across the building doing video applications, to, again, lower barriers to entry, and 5-page applications. I mean, if you've ever gone in a DOE or looked at our DOE website and downloaded any of our applications, we're talking about 150 pages of text. So it's really complex, and that is a justice issue and an equity issue. So, Secretary Granholm was very focused on that on day one, and we've been tinkering a lot to lower those barriers to entry. So thank you for that question.
So we'll do one more quick one that we received from a student ahead of time. And the question is really around the balance of the challenge of food and energy, particularly when, we're talking about biofuels on farmlands. We're talking about solar and wind deployment, not as much with wind, just because wind's got a kind of a lower footprint, so to speak. But as we're talking about larger scale solar deployments, how would you advise us from a state perspective to kind of think about that balance? And, how do we, I think as a people, sort of grapple with that, particularly when, correctly point out that as we're grounded in people, there are people in this nation who struggle with that food or feed challenge on a daily basis.
So I'm going to say something radical in the last 2 minutes of our time together. And that is the assumptions that are embedded in the question are that the same types of entities that have been leading development for the last 150 years will continue to lead it in the future. And that there will not be a true sharing of economic benefits and prosperity in development. And so I think communities would not be asking that question if they knew out of the gate that they have a 50% ownership stake in the project, that they're actually going to get the economic benefits from the project on day one, that there's a citizens advisory board on day one. I mean, we're assuming that development is always going to happen the way it's happened. And the work that I'm doing every day and the work that I've done in the past is to challenge that assumption. The system and the systems that have actually facilitated development don't work in the climate future that we have. They don't work given the scale and speed of development required to meet the climate challenge. We're going to ask so many communities to house development. We're going to ask so many communities to house industrial development, to house clean energy projects, because we're fighting climate change. That means that the largesse, that the economic benefits of those projects have to be shared. So the assumption, the underlying assumptions have to change. Community ownership of energy assets, for example, that's another pathway. That's something that we've talked about in the building. That should not be radical. Denmark, Germany, I mean, these are places that knew they needed to rapidly scale up. And in order to ask a farmer to house a wind project, which actually in my mind does have a big impact because that's a forever project, right? You're never taking out a wind turbine. Or if you are, it's going to be a long process. So they knew that they were going to be asking community members to shoulder the energy transition in those countries. We're going to be asking communities to do the same thing. But our underlying assumption, at least in the mainstream, is that, it's going to be the way it's always been. It's like, no. And actually, we have utilities in other places, in New Mexico, for example, thinking about, okay, well, we knew we needed the tribe to actually own part of this to get it done. So that's the next frontier. New business models. We're in the business school, right? What are the business models that actually allow for everyone to win? Are there those business models? Let's write about that. Let's talk about those models. Let's churn them out. Model those for us so that we can actually demonstrate that in our funding opportunities and require that as we're sending those funding opportunities out the door. So this is the exciting world that we're in. Everything's on the table in the clean energy transition.
Well, I'm really glad we snuck that one in because that was a fabulous answer. That certainly got me thinking, and I hope it has all of you thinking too. So help me in thanking Shalanda Baker for her comments here today. This is so great.
Yeah, thank you so much.